Hello and welcome to the Elders Insight, an exciting new podcast series presented by Hepworth & Associates, your source for advocacy, advisory, and planning insights for seniors, pre-seniors, and their caring families. Today's podcast is sponsored by Rotary Dial Media. So let's get started with the show on location today in Toronto.
Well, we are back with another podcast episode of the Elders Insight. We continue to thank you for all your positive responses, and we're getting lots of them, and we thank you all for your emails, thoughts, and thumbs up. Clearly, by the number of people who have downloaded our podcast, we're onto something here, and that there really is a need for the kind of information that we're bringing to all of you. So please continue to stay tuned for more episodes. Tell everyone you know to dial in, or I guess the phrase is click in. And remember, all the episodes of the Elders Insight are recorded and available at the Hepworth & Associates website, www.hepworth.ca. So let's get on with today's episode. My name is Gary Hepworth, and I'm your host with this podcast here on the Elders Insight, and today live from downtown Toronto, Canada. Today's episode is entitled Myths and Realities About Aging, and I'm particularly excited about it, not just because it's an area we don't always talk about, but because of who our guest is today. So when it comes to aging, and depending upon how old you are, our views can be affected by stereotypes, media portrayals, one-offs, and plus our vivid imaginations. The results of these perspectives can often lead to anxiety associated with aging, which is often misplaced. But the one thing we can all agree on is that we know we are living longer. So to talk about this entire subject of aging, who better to be sitting right in front of me than Dr. Samir Sinha. He currently serves as the Director of Geriatrics at Sinai Health System and the University Health Network in Toronto, and is the Peter and Sheila Godso Chair in Geriatrics at Mount Sinai Hospital. In 2012, he was appointed by the Government of Ontario to serve as the expert lead of Ontario's Seniors Strategy. He's also an associate professor in the Departments of Medicine, Family and Community Medicine, and the Institute of Health Policy, Management and Evaluation at the University of Toronto, and an assistant professor of medicine at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. He's also a Rhodes Scholar, completed his undergraduate medical studies at the University of Western Ontario. He also obtained a master's degree in medical history and a doctorate in sociology at the University of Oxford's Institute of Aging. And along with all that, he's also co-chair of the advisory board for the National Institute on Aging, right here in Toronto. Bottom line, Dr. Sinha is a passionate and respected advocate for the needs of older adults. And we're thrilled to have him here today on the Elders Insight. Dr. Sinha, welcome.
Thank you very much, Gary. It's a pleasure to be here.
So today's subject is myths and realities about aging. So let's start with the myths. What are the most common myths associated with aging?
I think there's a lot of myths that we have because a number of us have never experienced aging before. It's a very personalized experience, and for many people out there, they start having these notions about what we see in the media, and also a lot of the negative stereotypes that we associate with aging in our society. So we think that as you get old, you're probably going to get demented, you probably have incontinence, you probably can't get around, you're probably a bad driver, and then it's just really all one big downhill journey, if you will. And that's a challenge because I think a lot of people then naturally assume that as you get old, it just gets worse by the day. And I find that very problematic as a physician because, a lot of the conversations that patients will start with me is, so my doctor tells me that this is just because I'm aging. Is that really true? Like, as if it is, great, I guess. But I somehow don't believe that that's the case. And that's often how we start kind of dispelling those myths and realities about, what is responsible, what is because of aging and what is because of, poor health, and how do we actually find a path forward.
So, okay, then let's look at the realities. What is the actual reality about aging? We're all living longer. Life expectancy in this country is soared now for 84, 85. So what is the reality? What could someone expect?
Yeah, so first of all, we have to take aging in perspective in Canada, right? Why are we all talking about aging? Well, if you think about, 1900 in Canada, our life expectancy was 51 years of age, right? It doesn't mean that people only live till the age of 51 and then they just drop dead. It's the idea that the average person could expect to live to 51. Now, as you said, life expectancy is into our early 80s, so that's good, because I always say one of the greatest things we've accomplished is that we almost doubled our life life expectancy now. Now, of course, it means that some people will live longer and some people will live shorter lives. But on average, if you're lucky enough to make it to 65 in our society, and most of us will, you generally will have about 20 years of life expectancy ahead of you. And the majority of those are going to be in relatively good health. So that's the good news. And I think that's the first thing, is that a lot of people actually end up living longer than they planned to do so, and should expect to live longer than they may have expected to do so. And so then the question is, if you have those extra years, what are you going to do with that extra time? And what can you do to keep and stay healthy and independent for as long as possible? I think that's what we need to really focus on as we start thinking about what is the reality facing us moving forward, and how do we want to spend that time, and how do we want to make the most of that time ahead of us by living as healthy as possible and not necessarily in ill health.
So to that point, there's a huge demographic now over age 65. Now, there's more seniors in this country than children now.
Mm-hmm.
First time in our history, right? Knowing what you know about aging, what are people in their 50s? What should they be thinking about, paying attention to, knowing now that they're going to live into their 80s and 90s, into the hundreds?
Yeah, so the idea is that, as we start entering kind of middle age, if you will, and start thinking about, okay, wow, aging's creeping up on me, more so than I ever expected before, you have to start thinking about how are you going to improve what we sometimes call the longevity dividend, right? How are you going to make the most of it? So if you don't want to live longer, in ill health, then you might want to say, if I'm smoking, I should probably give that up. If I'm, an alcoholic, maybe I should just moderate what I drink, for example. If I've been, eating a really unhealthy diet, maybe I should concentrate on what I can do. And how do I start thinking about the things I can do to promote wellness and prevention? So dealing with hearing, dealing with vision, if those are becoming issues, are things that we can know can help prevent dementia, can prevent falls. Thinking about your bone health, right? If you are prone to having weaker bones, you might want to make sure that you are getting adequate sources of vitamin and calcium, and that you are participating in some regular exercise. And let me be clear, regular exercise doesn't mean running a marathon or pumping iron. It means, going for a good vigorous walk, maybe, a few times a week. And we say 150 minutes of exercise, or 30 minutes 5 times a week. These are all things we can start doing in our 50s to make sure that we're actually going to live, a more healthy life. That, and making sure that you actually have money saved up, so that if you actually have this notion of a retirement in any meaningful form, you're not going to necessarily age in poverty. So it's about making those financial decisions that, maybe I don't want to spend money on that super expensive car, or, how do I think about those things that I need to get done so I'm not retiring with a mortgage on the book still. 1 in 5 Canadians is at the moment. How do I make sure that, I will have enough money so I can actually live a reasonable lifestyle in those later ages?
I think you've touched on some key areas. So healthcare, exercise, diet, money. One thing I always mention to our clients is, think about where you're going to live, too.
Yeah.
People think, okay, I'm going to live in a retirement home. Well, most people don't live in retirement homes. So most people I know want to age at their home. So that's one thing they need to factor. But I think if you talk to a lot of seniors, and you mentioned earlier, there's still a fear that, oh my God, I'm going to get dementia or Alzheimer's. Is that a fear that people should have, or what's the numbers showing us right now in terms of the degree of that in society?
Yeah, I think, when it starts coming to some of those things that we do fear, right? Like, what is the prevalence of things like osteoporosis? What is the prevalence of issues like incontinence? And the big thing that scares most people is, the fear of dementia, right? Mm-hmm. So, in terms of, if you look at all comers, all Canadians 65 plus right now, and that's about 5 million Canadians, we would say less than 1 in 10, or even between 5 to 10% of that whole population is living with a dementia. So it's not the majority, it's a small number. But we know dementia is one of those things where it's mostly related to age, but also a large amount of it is related to lifestyle factors. So when we talk about types of dementia, vascular dementia in particular, if you lived a lifestyle where you'll have an unhealthy heart, for example, you have high cholesterol, you have high blood pressure, you have things that may make you prone to having heart disease or strokes, for example, that's the type of dementia that we can actually make huge strides in preventing by being more attuned to our vascular health and our overall well-being. So, for example, we know that there are hundreds of thousands of people who are less likely to be living with dementia today, or millions of people less likely around the world, because they're doing better care around their heart health than we were, say, 20 years ago. So that's the good news, is that less people are living with dementia today than we thought there would be 20 years ago. So it reminds us that there are some preventative things we can do. But we do know that as you age, once you hit your 80s, once you hit your 90s, the prevalence of things like dementia, start creeping up to 25, 35%, or even more by the age of 100. At least 40 to 50% of people living with dementia. So back to your other point is, so what's your living situation going to be, and how do you get in front of that? So for example, what I did was, my friend Lindsay Green wrote this great book called A Perfect Home for a Long Life. While I was reading that, I made my latest housing purchase, which was, I used to live in a 2-story apartment. I now live in a 1-story apartment. All the doorways are actually bigger than 32 inches, wide. Why? That's the international standard for a wheelchair and walker. I have made sure that this is an apartment that has no levels, and that I can actually die in the apartment. And when I want to type that angry letter when I'm 95, my personal support worker, can wheel me through to any room, to whatever computer I want. And I'm living in a neighborhood with restaurants, so I probably don't want to use Meals on Wheels. I probably just want to send downstairs to a local restaurant like my other friends, or more importantly, my patients have taught me that's kind of the better way to go. So it's thinking about that future and how you can prepare for it by making smart housing decisions, by making financial decisions to say, spending $6,000 or $7,000 or $8,000 a month on a retirement home, which is really a glorified condo, you could actually spend that money and then some to generously pay someone to live with you, for example, in that guest room or the room that your child was in before, and allow you to age in your own home and actually spend less money and save more to actually have more care at home in the long term. It's thinking about that future and being practical about it is what I would start saying we could do, in our 40s and 50s, because I always say, the best defense is a great offense.
Oh, yeah. So you have your aging in place strategy all figured out?
My patients taught me everything I need to know, right?
There you go. I have experience in the home care business. Maybe 5-6 years ago, I would have no problem trying to recruit PSWs, personal support workers, caregivers. Recently, in fact, there's a lot of articles now showing that there seems to be a shortage.
Yep.
Variety of reasons. A lot of clients want to live in their homes, and which sometimes, as you said, sometimes requires a live-in caregiver, or just someone who comes in for 3-4 hours a day. But if we're starting to see a challenge with, are there enough people out there to do this work? Just like you might have some thoughts on that topic.
Absolutely. I mean, we're having, it's a huge issue right now because people don't necessarily want to spend the time, kind of working in careers of caring for people when they pay badly, right? I'll be honest, as a physician, I get paid well, right? I'm very grateful for that. But I can tell you, for those people who probably, on some days, I would argue, work harder than I do as a personal support worker, maybe bathing, someone's demented mother, for example, which is not easy work to do, running around taking care of a bunch of clients and being paid minimum wage. I would rather, personally, it's not uncommon. We used to say this with the previous minister. If you could actually get paid more serving coffee at the local Tim Hortons versus actually doing really, really tough and challenging and highly skilled work, in my view, which would you rather choose? Do we blame people that in this area, personal support workers have a turnover rate of 50 to 60% a year? We can't blame them. If you were paid that little, it's just like the folks who don't want to pick fruit, right? We say don't take our jobs away, and yet none of us want to necessarily do that work. So this is a problem that we have. And I think the key is we have to recognize that if we actually do want to have people doing this sort of work, we've got to pay them a living wage. We have to recognize them for the work they do. And in other countries like Denmark, where they have very strong, robust home care systems, part of that's predicated on paying people who do this work a reasonable wage, and recognizing that this is important work and it's skilled work. So we do need to actually do things to better bolster the workforce, and I think part of it's wage, part of it's education and standards, and making sure these people are valued just as much as I'm valued as a caring professional.
So it's talking to clients in their 50s and above. It's not often just the individual that's planning for their aging, it's their family, right? And I'm sure you see a lot of families here with your practice. What message would you have for the families in terms of helping elderly parents preparing for the journey ahead?
I think the first one is just talk. talk about it, right? Don't keep this as an issue that we'll deal with it when we have to deal with it, because often, again, I said a great defense, is a good offense. So I actually, as part of my, when patients start with me, I always ask them, have you actually, have you done any advanced care planning? Have you actually discussed your goals of care? And more often than not, people haven't. We know from the stats that the majority of Canadians haven't actually participated or partaken in advanced care planning. And most people will say, oh no, I have a will. And I say, well, I don't really care what happens after you cross the finish line. I want to know what the last 100 meters looks like, right? Because that's where all the tough decisions need to be made. That's where, if you're now demented, for example, and you can no longer authorize how your bank, how your funds can be spent, all of a sudden you get in these very awkward situations where, for example, you might be blessed to be sitting on, a few $100,000 that could pay for the care to give you what you wanted to age in place at home. But actually, I've seen situations where the family members can't actually access that funds because they haven't been authorized as a power of attorney for personal care finances. And really, then the question is, okay, well, we know mom's sitting on a few $100,000 that could pay for the care that we could access to help her live at home, but actually nobody has access to the dollars. But when she dies, we'll get all that money. But do we have to take out a loan now and then maybe know that we'll get that money back? It's a gong show. So that's why what I say to the families is, but tell everybody what you want. Would you want to have care at home? Some families say, I don't want care at home. I want to be cared in a facility and I want you just to come visit me, but I don't want to do that, right? So what are your choices? Because they're very individualized, very personal. And then think about, okay, well, if this is what I want, let's be realistic about how we save our funds, what we can expect government to do for us, what we need to do for ourselves, and then more importantly, what will be the roles of the family members? Who would you want to make decisions on your behalf if you couldn't make decisions for yourself? And get your paperwork in place, get your powers of attorney in place, get all that decided, knowing you can change that at any time. Because if you have all that in place and everybody knows what the plan is, it's very easy to manage your care, as opposed to doing the usual routine where there I am in the emergency department, mom's, collapse, nobody knows what the hell's going on, and then I'm saying, well, what did she want? And say, well, we didn't know. And how do you think your family members are going to feel in that situation? It's terrible to put that burden on them. So when most people tell me I don't want to be a burden on my family members, this is why I say this is a great opportunity for you. If you don't want to be a burden, then have a good chat. That way you have peace of mind knowing that your wishes will be carried out, and your families have peace of mind knowing they know what to do in the case of an emergency, or if you are one of those folks who may end up with dementia or something else.
And for those listeners who want to learn more about advanced care planning, I encourage you to go back and listen to some of the previous podcasts on this topic, because Dr. Sinha just eloquently added a great voice on that subject. Okay, what do we don't know? Is there anything that keeps you awake at night in terms of aging that we haven't addressed?
Well, I think some of the work that we do at the National Institute on Aging is really trying to help get an evidence-informed policy discussion. That sounds very dry, and people are saying, okay, this is the time I tune out. But the reason why I have gotten very involved in this work, and maybe at a younger age than most, is because, first of all, we're all going to age one day. We all aspire to be older people. I do. And I want to make sure that we get these things right, because Canada and most countries have never actually had an aging society before. And that means the social contract we created 50 years ago, for example, when we established Medicare and the average Canadian was 27 years of age, the current healthcare system doesn't work for an aging population. The current way that we've thought about pensions or other aspects doesn't necessarily work. The fact that 8.1 million Canadians are actually also serving as unpaid caregivers to family and friends, and the fastest growing group of caregivers in Canada are actually friends and neighbors, means that we've got to fundamentally rethink how we actually think about how we support older adults, how do we support caregivers, how do we actually help people make these things work. When the baby boom was coming through, We built more schools, we put more childcare, we put progressive policies in place to help people take time off for maternity leaves and not lose their pensionable benefits. But now when lots of people are leaving the workforce or taking breaks from the workforce earlier because they have to care for a mom or a family member, we don't actually give those same actual conditions. So that actually means that people then actually end up saving less. They actually end up having a worse pensionable situation than other people. And people say, well, tough luck for them. Well, actually, tough luck for all of us. Because frankly, when some Canadians as they age can't make it work, you know where they end up? They end up in hospital emergency departments. They end up in long-term care homes. And you know what? Who foots the bill? All of us.
Yes.
So there's actually a selfish interest that we should all have in saying, okay, we need to get this right. We need to have the right policies in place. And as we've been having a good, more focused conversation and trying to emphasize the importance of needing a national senior strategy, moving these things forward and getting people engaged and involved in those conversations, I think we're starting to slowly make victories, but there's a lot of work ahead of us that needs to be done. And so that's what I get very passionate about, is saying it's great that I get to do one-on-one care with individuals and families navigating a system that isn't ready for them. But more importantly, how do we make sure that we get the system ready so that all of us can be supported, not necessarily to take care of us, but to actually help us all live the lives that we want to live moving forward.
So, final question for you. I know you travel quite extensively, other countries of the world, and I always talk about Japan because it's the oldest country in the world. It's 25% of the population in Japan, and it's already age 65. Are you seeing some things in Japan or other parts of the world that we should follow in terms of aging society?
So I was a visiting professor to Japan last year, and I thought I would go there and meet with all these other geriatricians who would show me all the latest, techniques in caring for older adults. And what I realized is actually geriatrics is not a well-established specialty, and geriatric care is not very well established in Japan. Japan actually has a pretty good home care system in place, which is allowing more people to age in place. But it's interesting that there's actually a lot that they seek to learn from us medically in terms of improving the way they care for older adults and actually allowing people to even return home in the first place. Japan Post has actually created an interesting model, something that we've actually had in fits and starts in Canada, where postal workers used to come and deliver mail on a regular basis. They're delivering less parcels today, but they still do routes. And so they actually do offer a paid service, and they do this in other countries too, where they will actually check in on your loved ones for you, especially when your sons or daughters or other relatives are on the other side of the country. So that's kind of a cool way to take existing services and adapting them for the needs of an aging population. But, I haven't found one country that's got it right, but I was recently in Denmark, and what I was really impressed was a huge commitment they made to expanding the provision of home and community care, and really, a real philosophy of how do we support people to stay resilient, healthy, and independent. So even, there was a cool facility in Copenhagen where it was a place where you could go and see your future house, where you could go in and say, okay, well, if I get disabled or if I am demented, what are the adaptations? What's the equipment that I can buy? Well, I can take a contractor in here and say, okay, this is what you need to do in my kitchen, to actually make it work for me as I get older or as I might have these limitations. And I think it's that forward thinking and that more community-based approach that really impressed me in terms of saying, okay, there are some countries that are really being more proactive to think about aging as an opportunity to actually make good decisions and leveraging various assets we can to get better results for everybody overall. So I think no one's got it perfect, but I think there's an opportunity, I would say, to invest in R&D, which is not research and design, but rob and duplicate. If someone else has figured it out, steal it and let's put it in place, because you know what? Some of us are aging faster than others.
You heard it here, folks. Rob and duplicate. So, Dr. Sinha, fascinating chat. This was great. Big thanks to you on behalf of our listeners and yours truly. As you know, our advice to our clients and listeners is about planning and the peace of mind that comes from it. So it's good to hear from someone who lives this issue every day.
A pleasure.
Okay, folks, that wraps up today's podcast. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for clicking in. Again, thanks to Dr. Samir Sinha for taking his time out of, I know, his very busy schedule, so I really appreciate your time today. All your comments have been encouraging. Look forward to new podcasts. Keep your ideas coming. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today on the Elders Insight. We hope you found this podcast helpful, informative, interesting, and most of all, fun. We hope you can join us for our future podcasts as we continue to be your source for advocacy, advisory, and planning insights for seniors, pre-seniors, and their caring families. A big thanks to Hepworth and Associates team, and we look forward to seeing you the very next time here on the Elders Insight.